Open up your Bibles to Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk chapter 3. We're going to be looking at the whole chapter of the end of Habakkuk. So we looked at Habakkuk 1 and 2 the last two Sundays, and now we're in the third and final section of Habakkuk in verses 1 through 19. Fear may be the most fascinating of human emotions. We all experience it to varying degrees, but we also all experience fear at times for radically different reasons. There are good reasons to fear in this world. We should all be afraid of downed power lines in our roads. Everyone should also be afraid of breaking into Jamie and Karen Badia's house in the middle of the night. That is a good fear to have. There are also bad fears to have. None of us should be paralyzed in fear over meeting new people. We shouldn't allow social anxiety to shut us up in our home. A fear of conflict should not prevent us from speaking the truth in order to proclaim the devastating effects of sin in people's lives. We all have fears that are good, fears that are bad. I, in some ways, possess that millennials' fear of talking on the phone. I hate my fear that I have of phone conversations, but to be honest, whenever the phone rings in my office, my immediate thought is that someone's going to call me and they're going to call to say, Sean, I can't stand what you said on Sunday. I never want to see you again, and they're going to hang the phone up. I think that before every time I pick up the phone call. It's bad enough that occasionally I'm afraid to call people, because I'm afraid that when I call them up, they're going to say, oh, Sean, I'm glad you've called me. I've been waiting to tell you I can't stand what you said on Sunday, and I never want to speak to you again. That is not a good fear. That is a bad fear to have. And one of our problems is that in this 21st century world, Americans are allowing our lives to be ruled by those fears. Fears of governmental takeovers. Fear of sicknesses, fear of social gatherings, fear of toxins that are in our food, fear of the weather. Don't we all know that next storm is always right around the corner? As an illustration for that, I went onto the National Hurricane Weather Center on Monday, and sure enough, the first image right on the screen is storms Peter and Rose in the Atlantic making their way toward the west. There is always something to be afraid of. And fear sells. News agencies know it. Politicians know it. Advertisers know it. Scam artists know it. Everyone knows fear sells, and so they will use your fears to drive you to live as they desire. So how do we continue to live for God in the midst of these fears? How do we keep reaching out to the world, loving our friends, loving our church, and being active for Christ when our fears are telling us to shut the doors, hide inside, and avoid the world? Something the adversary, the devil, would love for everyone in the church to do. The way to overcome our fears in this world is through a greater fear. The scriptures make it clear, from the laws of old in the Old Testament to the teachings of Jesus, that we overcome our fear of the world with the greater fear of God. Or another way that we could state it, the fear of worship overwhelms the fear of the world. The book of Habakkuk shows us that if we want to endure these fearful, these stormy times in this world, we need to have three things. In chapter 1, we saw we first need to be honest with God about these tumultuous times. Last week, we saw we need to place our faith in God and trust in Him in these terrifying times. And then this morning, we're going to see that we need to fear God in worship in order to be contented and strong in these fearful hours. So let's look now at the introduction of this song in the introduction and the first line of what Habakkuk brings us. So Habakkuk 3 verses 1 and 2 say, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. The first line of chapter 3 is the biggest reason that I think Habakkuk was not just a prophet, but he was a Levite who was leading in worship in the temple. Habakkuk is someone who, based on what he writes in this song, has both spent a lot of time in the Mosaic Law and a lot of time in the Psalms of worship that dominate the worship in Solomon's temple. And I like to think that after Habakkuk had his back and forth between the Lord on the justice of his kingdom and also the judgment coming from the Babylonians, that Habakkuk then spent some time in the Psalms. And after reading about God and who he is, Habakkuk then writes this song to say that, Lord, I have heard the report about you. And what brings about this song is not the message of what God is about to do in Judah, but what inspires this song is Habakkuk hearing a report about the Lord. And as Habakkuk meditated on who God is in the law and in the Psalms, the result of that is Habakkuk said, I heard about you, God, and I became afraid. Now, we are being trained in America today to almost always see fear as something that is wrong. Fear is a disorder. Anxiety is something to be smothered by entertainment or chemical substances, from alcohol to fatty foods to psychiatric drugs. The scriptures tell us that fear is not wrong. Fear is a gift from the Almighty, but like all of God's gifts, from love to sex to food to wealth, food is a good thing that is all too often abused by the curse. The scriptures are clear from beginning to end. We are to be people who fear the Lord. Fear is the right response to God's glory in judgment and even to God's glory in mercy. Fear and trembling is how we should feel when we hear of God's majesty and God's power in creation. Fear should draw us into God's presence, and the fear of God is the start of how we walk in righteousness and in grace in this world. If we spent the smallest amount of time as a church meditating on the songs that we sing each and every Sunday, it should cause us to shake in fear over the one whom we are magnifying. We sang this morning, joyful, joyful, we adore thee. God of glory and Lord of love. We are singing that God is the God of all glory. We are singing that the Creator and the King is present with us in the midst of His majesty. That the one that the stars and the angels proclaim, that is the one that we are proclaiming. These thoughts on the greatness of God in our hymns are of such grandeur that it is borderline disturbing. I just think about it. We sang this morning that our God is so amazing that He can hold the oceans in His hands. Our God is so intelligent and meticulous in His care that He has numbered all of the grains of sand in this world. We've sang that God has a wisdom that so surpasses us, we can't even question it, and His deeds are so wonderful, we can't even fathom that all. And then after singing about God's greatness, the one who is seated on the throne, whose worth is beyond all compare, we sing that same God sent His Son to this world to have His hands pierced by the nails and to die for our sin and our guilt. This is a terrifying degree of love. to read of the sheer magnitude of the eternal God, and then to know that he would send his Son to die for us, to freely forgive us and offer his grace. When we read of that, we shouldn't sit here and say, oh yeah, no, I know that. It should overwhelm us with the magnificence of God. His love is to such a degree that it should control our heart, and his Spirit should drive us into a healthy fear of God that at the same time drives away our fears of the world in this present time. Habakkuk prays, in wrath, remember mercy. Because after Habakkuk meditated on the report of the Lord's work and the history of his people, Habakkuk has come to see that the Babylonians are not who matters when it comes to the Jewish people over the next 20 years. What matters is the wrath and the mercy of God that will be brought upon Judah. Because if God so chose, he could have diverted Nebuchadnezzar away from Jerusalem in 100 different ways. One of the things that blew me away the most when tracking through Jeremiah and Ezekiel, when we went through it several months ago, were the number of times that if God wanted to, he could have delivered Jerusalem, but because of their hard hearts, he brought judgment upon them. You see, it is not our enemies that matters. What matters is God's movement in our lives. It is his holiness and his wrath and also his mercy and his grace. So Habakkuk knew that even in the midst of the confusing and the daunting days of that time, what mattered most is, will God be merciful to me? The worship of God should draw us into a fear of God as we meditate on the glory of who he is, both in his judgments and his grace, his wrath and his mercy. And as we meditate on the glory of God, at the same time, that should draw out the fear of the world that resides in our hearts and in our minds. Because when we begin to look at the world through the lens of the fear of God, what we end up seeing is that even if the doctors fail to diagnose my sickness, even if that sick person comes up to me and they cough right in my face, even if the insurance company fails to pay a cent of what they owe me after this storm, and the Justice Department fails the one that we love, or whatever other fear stirs up your heart, even if the worst of your fears becomes reality tomorrow, we need to know that the grandeur of our God is even greater than those fears. The Lord of heaven and earth can carry us through everything. In my short 38 years on this earth, I have lived in Binghamton, New York, Greenville, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Groton, New York, and now River Ridge, Louisiana. And out of the 5 moves in my life, if I had to rank them from most scary to least scary, I'd probably say my least scary move was the one into Binghamton, New York, because when you're first being born into this world, you don't have anything to be scared of at all. And probably the scariest one, though, was the first move I had away from home. When I went to Bob Jones University in Greenville, it was terrifying to be away from my parents. I was just as scared to be moving into a university with enough rules to smother my spirit. But each time I moved, it's brought its own fears and terrors with it. Moving to D.C. was like nothing else in the world. I mean, just the roads in Washington, D.C. alone just crippled me in fear. The crazy people driving on them, the amount of traffic, and the simple knowledge that Lanham, Maryland, where the school was located, was number 1 in America for carjackings and car shootings. You know, that'll get your blood drawn when you're driving down the road. The move to Groton, New York had its own fears. I was moving into the country in the middle of nowhere, a lifestyle I've never experienced before. And I was also going to a group of people who are all older than my parents and were now going to see me as their pastor. And as you all know from experience, just how terrifying it is to live in River Ridge or Metairie. When I told my family and friends I was moving down here, they were talking to me like, there are alligators roaming the streets everywhere. A hurricane hits us every other weekend. Mardi Gras depravity is everywhere. That's how the world outside views this area. But I got to say, moving down here was probably my least terrifying move. I had so little fear because after the 4 moves before, I realized it doesn't matter where I go, to the north, the south. No matter where I live in this world, it doesn't matter where I am because God is with me. And so a simple experiential knowledge of the presence of God throughout this world let me know that it doesn't matter where I go because God will always hold me fast. And every time we gain in our hearts and in our minds another simple truth about who God is, in His character, in His power, and in His compassion, the result of that should be the more we know God, the more we fear God for who He is, the more it drives out fears in this world because we say, I can endure that. I can handle this because I know that if that comes into my life, I won't be alone because God will be with me. And so our greatest prayer in every trial and every tribulation, just like Habakkuk will be, Lord, revive your works. In your wrath, remember mercy. And then this brings us on to the main portion of Habakkuk's song, which is verses 3 through 15. And before I read this, I want to start to say the bulk of this song is given in imagery that might be a little bit of a struggle for us. But I encourage you as I'm reading this that you should use your sanctified imagination and really try to imagine and picture what Habakkuk is telling us. Because I believe that this song is the result of Habakkuk meditating on the reports of God that he read in the Psalms, the stories of God's past deliverance with Moses and Joshua and Judges and the prophets and the king. And as Habakkuk digested all of that majesty of God, he then gives us this song to say, this is what the Lord looks like to me. When I picture Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, the God of heaven's armies, this is what Habakkuk imagines. Let's start off with just the first half of this section in verses 3 through 7. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of His praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from His hands. And there is the hiding of His power. Before Him goes pestilence, and plague comes after Him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered. The ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. Taking all of these images together, God coming from the desert south of the land of Judah in His radiant power, pestilence coming before and after Him, causing the peoples of the desert to quake in fear before Him. Taking all of that in, it appears what Habakkuk is doing is that he is giving us physical and tangible images of what Habakkuk believes God looked like when He came to deliver His people from Egypt, when He came to rescue them out of slavery and then to take them up from the deserts and bring them to the promised land. For Habakkuk, when he reads of the images of the Lord in Exodus through Deuteronomy, this is the image that comes to Habakkuk's mind. I don't think that we're to take any of these images and correlate them from one story or to another, specifically in the Exodus and wilderness wanderings. But Habakkuk is saying that once you hear of God, once you meditate on all he has done for his people in wrath and in mercy, this is the image that comes forth in Habakkuk's mind. And I think this image is asking us a simple question. And that is, who is like the Lord our God? And who is like this God? No one. Because what we see in the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy is that God is king. God is Lord over all of the nations. The greatest power in this world, the Egyptians, the surrounding nations and desert tribes trembled before his majesty. What was thought to be unassailable and unconquerable was thrown down before the glory of the Lord. Verse 6 is probably the most interesting verse in this description of God's majesty. And I want to read it from the New King James Version because their translation's a little bit more accurate. The New King James says, "And the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting." The intriguing thing is that Habakkuk describes both the mountains and God's own ways and plans with the same Hebrew word. And that is the word olam. Olam means eternal or everlasting. And so Habakkuk says the mountains, which from our perspective are eternal and everlasting, nothing's going to break the mountains and the hills down. And Habakkuk says, compared to the plans of God, they are broken to pieces before his eternal glory, which is meant to communicate to us that the things in this world that we are so terrified of, that appear to be unbreakable, everlasting, unstoppable, from the mountains of the land of Israel to the military might of America or China today, to the grip that these massive technology companies appear to have over our lives through our gadgets and social media and everything else. All of them are frail and dust before the eternal plans of God. So what this means for us today is that whatever you fear right now, whatever fears are driving your heart, are altering your behaviors and actions, causing you to be the person you don't want to be, because fear is directing your behavior. You who fear the Lord must ask, is what I fear as enduring as my God? Is what I fear in this world impenetrable before the power of the Lord? And we will always answer that with no. And this is why our worship, this is why the songs that we sing on Sunday are of such importance. Because we need that weekly, we need that regular time where we can gather together as a people and meditate on the majesty of God, on the greatness of God in comparison to our problems that feel so great, that feel like we can't overcome them. But in comparison to God's greatness, they are nothing. So we come together and we sing songs like, Jesus is the sweetest name I know. And what an amazing song to read about how our lives were wrecked by sin and strife. And Jesus swept across our lives and brought our hearts to life. He gives us these feasts of his grace And we need to take in those glorious truths and lead them into the next week so that we can say, whatever sin and strife tries to do tomorrow or next week, I know that I will make it through that sin. I will make it through that strife because Jesus will once again repair what has been broken. He will fix what has been torn down with his love. When we glory in who God is, when we worship him in his greatness, we can't help but be so filled with God's glory that it drives out darkness and sin. But sadly, we take our times of worship and singing so much for granted that when we're singing songs like Jesus is the sweetest name I know, we spend our times instead thinking, I'm not really a big fan of this tune. I would rather be singing this other song instead of glorying in the truth of God that is there for the taking, that can change our lives this very week. And when we meditate on God, we glory not only in who God is as Lord, but we are also to take comfort in what God has done and what God will do in our lives. Look at verses 8 through 15 as now Habakkuk meditates on God's actions. Did the Lord rage against the rivers? Or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare. The rods of chastisement were sworn. Selah. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and quaked. I hope you're imagining what this would look like in your mind. The downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. The sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation you marched through the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed one. You struck the head of the house of evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. Selah. You pierced with his own spears the heads of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exaltation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. These verses find their inspiration from the days of Moses, Joshua, Judges, and even days that are future to Habakkuk in the days of Daniel. Now, we don't have time to draw out everything here like I would like to, but what I want to key in on is the beginning of verse 13, because that tells us what these verses are all about. Surrounded by verses of violence and disaster and devouring and flooding, and that's why we really got to key in on the beginning of verse 3, because I don't know about you, but if I had to choose any time period of when to live, and also location of where to live, I wouldn't want to place my family. I wouldn't want to place this church in those days and those locations where the ground is shaking, where spears are piercing enemies. We do not willingly choose to live in days of war and disaster, but we would much rather put ourselves in places of peace and prosperity. But one of the points of Habakkuk 3 is to let us know what is God doing in the midst of all of these days of turmoil. We read, you went forth for the salvation of your people. So what is the purpose of all this pain, all this sorrow, all this anger? Why does God say he marches through the world in indignation of all character traits? He does it for the salvation of his people. And you know, during this age, we are all going to be forced to endure some dark and dramatic times. The darkness started at the fall and it will not end till the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. Even the millennial kingdom, when Christ rules on earth, will end in war. But here's the thing. These days are not in vain. These days are not without purpose. In the end, the wars of nations, the pandemics, the hurricanes, the poverty, all of it will have been to show forth how salvation can come to those who believe. And in the midst of these times, rewards will come to those who were faithful in the midst of the storm. And the only way we're going to be able to see ourselves through these times of disaster and heartache is if we fix our eyes on Jesus Christ and his lordship over all creation. If we remember that our God is reigning and ruling today, just as surely as he will be when Jesus sits on the throne in Jerusalem, it should cause us to be able to rest in him, so that when every worker of iniquity, everyone who persecutes the saints, everyone who stabs you in the back tomorrow, we know that they will be judged under the holiness of God. No one will escape his wrath. And every child of faith, every member of the family of God will find a mercy they could have never foreseen right in the middle of this storm. Because when the Lord rides forth, his people will be saved as a result of his work. God will not lose a single person who is hidden in his hand. Not a single sheep from his flock will be lost. God is going forth in your salvation in these days, so we need to trust him. And along with trusting God, we need to fear him. We need to fear him more than the darkness that surrounds. And once we fear the Lord, once we see him as the God and the King of all creation, we can sit in peace. We can sit in peace before the winds and the rain and the persecution, as that is the final end of Habakkuk's song in verses 16 through 19. Habakkuk says, I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he makes my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me walk on high places, for the choir director on my stringed instruments. Habakkuk 3, 16 through 19 is one of the great statements of faith in all of the Bible. It ranked right up there with Mary's faith that she was going to have the virgin birth, Peter's belief in Jesus as the Christ, and Martha's faith in the resurrection. Habakkuk states that even though God has prophesied that Babylon is going to come into Jerusalem and will judge and destroy God's people, they will starve and they will pillage. Habakkuk says that when the fruit is not on the vine, and this is not the result of a standard drought where we just didn't get enough rain this year, but the fruit is not on the vine because it will be burned and destroyed in the fields. Because the Jewish cattle will be slaughtered so the Babylonian armies can meet it. And while the Jews are hiding and starving behind the walls of Jerusalem, even in the darkest of God's judgments, Habakkuk says he will continue to do two things which seem crazy. He will exalt in the Lord, and he will rejoice in God's salvation. He will do this in the midst of God's judgment. And this might be the hardest reason to experience God's judgment, and that is God is judging Jerusalem not because of how Habakkuk is living, not because of all of Habakkuk's sin, but Habakkuk is just the collateral damage. I mean, it's one thing to experience pain in the world because you did idiotic things, because you were involved with sinful behavior. It's another thing to go through that pain because you're collateral damage of another's sin. It's so hard to rejoice and exalt in God when the pain of another person's anger, greed, and lust strikes your own heart. Yet Habakkuk says, even in that hour I will rejoice. And how can he do it? And I think that's the great question. How, God, can I be that person of rejoicing? How can I be that person of contentment and praise during the turmoil, during the times of war? And Habakkuk is able to say, I rejoiced because before my rejoicing, I was drawn into a state of trembling and fear due to my worship. Habakkuk begins this section by saying, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble. What caused Habakkuk to tremble? What did he just hear? What caused his trembling was the greatness of his God in verses 1 through 15. Since Habakkuk feared God, this meant that when the day of distress came, Habakkuk did not need to be distressed. When the overwhelming invasion of the enemy arrived, Habakkuk did not need to be overwhelmed because Habakkuk could be content in God's strength in times of loss and weakness because Habakkuk first feared the Lord. So if in your own times of loss, if you want to be that person who is able to be strong and who is able to be content in the poverty and in the loss, the key is to worship God first in the hours of peace. And I think worshiping God in fear, it really only requires one thing of the Christian, but it is something that is not always easy for us to do. If you want to worship God in fear, all you need to do is be active and engage your mind in worship. Really think about those words that are coming out of your mouth and what you're saying. We really sing the most outlandish things every Sunday morning. I mean, to stand up and sing that Jesus is the sweetest of all names. To sing that Jesus' strength never fails. To sing that God gives immortal gladness. That the earth and the heavens, all of the wonders of God's creation, all of it reflects His glory. To sing that Jesus died and rose from the dead and then ascended to heavens in glory. We sang about all those truths this morning, and if we're honest, every single one of them is crazy. I mean, think about it. How outlandish is it to believe that there is one person who has unfailing strength? There is nothing in this world that is too hard for him to do. And to think not only that this one person has the ability to do whatever he wants, but he created this world so it is all for him. And then when this world was all for him, and he could do anything that he wanted to, what did he choose to do? He chose to send his son to this world to die for us because he loves us. This is crazy. And we sing about it Every single Sunday, we sing truths that should drive us to the floor, that should cause us to quake in fear over how glorious our God is. I'll admit that I get too callous about it too. I mean, I put in the wrong version of joyful, we adore you. I got 2 versions of it in the PowerPoint, in my slides on my computer. Picked the wrong one, got the words all off. I don't know about you, but after that point, I'm like, it's over. I got one song wrong. I ruined the whole thing. That's all anybody's going to be thinking about that. And I'm thinking about that while knowing I'm about to preach a sermon on the importance of keeping your mind active and thinking about what you're singing. It's so hard to do. But these songs are such a gift. The worship of God on Sunday is what should provide us with the contentment and the strength that we need throughout the week, so that when this world pulls us down, we can get back up. And we're not going to get back up because we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and say, you know what? I got this. Whatever this world throws at me, I got it. I'm strong enough. I'm good enough. I know the right people. I got the right connections. I can take care of this. No, we can get back up on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday because we can say, I know the God who has everything. I know the God who can do everything. The only way we can rest on God throughout the week is when we gather together to fear God through an inspiration of worship to God. And I would argue that anything other than the fear of the Lord is far too little to drive out the fears of this world. Habakkuk had quite the remarkable change in this short book. In Habakkuk chapter 1, he is freaking out. God, this isn't fair. God, I can't stand that you're doing this. What, God, you're going to bring the Babylonians in answer to my prayers? I hate all this. I mean, Habakkuk 1 is temper tantrum extraordinaire. And by the end, Habakkuk's saying, all right, God, bring it on. I'm going to rejoice. I'm going to exalt. I'm going to be content through it all. How did that change happen? It happened first because Habakkuk was honest. He was honest to say, I hate this. I'm afraid of this. I'm terrified of this. Second, the change came because Habakkuk put his faith in the right source. He turned to God because the just will live by faith. He believed in the Lord, and that began to change everything. And then what finally drove out that fear of this world was a fear of God. Habakkuk went back to the Psalms. He went back to what he knew about God. And when he looked at God, who he is again afresh, Habakkuk feared the Lord and not what was about to come into his life. And so if you are struggling in these storms, if they are driving you down into fear and terror, let us follow Habakkuk's simple path to contentment and to peace. Let's be honest to the Lord. Let's have faith in the Lord. And then let us have the fear of the Lord. And when we draw to God, He will draw near to us in grace and strength.